As you may know, Yu-Gi-Oh is a very complicated game, and it's definitely much more complicated than it once was. And the Yu-Gi-Oh landscape is definitely not ideal, and definitely not too welcoming to new players, at least not as welcoming as I would like it to be. But don't give up hope, because I've got a few tips that I think would benefit newer returning players, and some of this advice are tips that I wish I knew when I started the game. But before I start the video, feel free to like, comment, and share this video, and feel free to check out my other videos and subscribe if you really like my content. But without any further ado, let's get into it. So this first tip is probably one of the most highly recommended tips that I could give, since it really comes in handy from a financial standpoint. So what do I mean? If you've ever seen Yu-Gi-Oh apps like Yu-Gi-Oh Pro or Dueling Book, you know that these are great tools for playtesting and deck building. It can help you get a good grasp on what kind of deck you want to build by giving you the option to build a digital deck for free. And this is a major money saver, since it allows you to see if the deck works before you actually build it. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen new players blow a lot of money on physical cards without playtesting them on something like Dueling Book. And this was especially true back in the day, since we didn't have something like Yu-Gi-Oh Pro. And this is the process that can save you a lot of money, since you don't have to blindly dump money on a deck that you're not 100% sure if it's going to work. And things like Master Duel only really expand your options from this point. So moving on to the next tip, this has to do with a mistake that I see a lot of new players often make. And I often see them spend a lot of money on packs, special editions, or boxes in general, and mainly this later point. And the mentality is that they're going to be able to get their hands on a bunch of Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and they likely have the impression that they'll be able to build a competent deck based on these cards. And while I can see why new players might think this, it's a huge mistake, and they'll soon realize that they're losing a ton of duels because the deck that they built is made of a bunch of mismatched cards. And the downside in buying a bunch of packs is that you won't be guaranteed to get a specific card that you need, especially if you're trying to build an archetype-based deck. And the cost of boxes usually outweighs the benefit, since boxes are so expensive and they may not even give you half of the cards that you need for a deck. So it's better to buy singles, since you can directly get the cards that you need. However, new players may be tempted to buy a box, since they can get a bunch of cards that they need, and this is just a huge mistake, and they'll likely spend more money to hunt down the cards that they need, at least the remaining cards that they need for their deck, and it's basically a huge money pit. So the conclusion is, buy singles. So this next one is a big one, and please listen to this advice. Please, oh please, do not build a deck before the ban list. You don't know which decks are going to get hit for sure, and you could be in the middle of building a deck only for the ban list to come around and derail your deck build. The best way to avoid this is by keeping a close eye of when the ban list is going to hit. You can check out Konami's official website to see when the ban list might drop, and keeping tabs on the ban list will keep you in the loop of when to not build a deck. And this can save you a lot of money, since you potentially avoid spending and wasting money on cards that might get hit on the ban list. So this next one is crucial, and this is a mistake that I see a lot of new players make time and again, and even regular players make this mistake. And it starts when they begin to see a lot of wins on Yu-Gi-Oh apps such as Yu-Gi-Oh Pro or Dueling Book. And the problem starts when the new player takes the deck to a tournament. Now, they might win at a local tournament, but they'll soon see at some places like Nationals that the meta decks pretty much mop the floor with this Yu-Gi-Oh Pro deck. So the newbie is likely flustered and confused at this point, since they've experienced so much success with this deck on Yu-Gi-Oh Pro. So how could they possibly lose so hard to a tournament deck? Well, the problem is that the majority of these decks on Yu-Gi-Oh Pro and Dueling Book is that they're casual or fun decks, And even though someone is using Sky Strikers on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro, and even though Sky Strikers are considered to be meta at the time, the Sky Striker deck on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro is the casual version of that quote-unquote meta deck. So these so-called meta decks on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro are not optimized to the degree that a tournament level deck is. Whether it comes down to the way the side deck and the main deck is built, these meta decks are constructed to be the most competitive decks, to have the most competitive cards, and they're designed to gain as much advantage as possible, which is why they mop the floor with these Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro decks. So it means that these casual decks on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro are not made with the same competitiveness in mind, which means that these decks are not likely to use the same competitive cards that the meta decks use. So this is what creates the disparity, and this is what the newbie makes of it. This is why they're likely to get more picked apart by the meta players, since the meta players are hyper competitive, and they use hyper competitive cards. And what's worse is that the newbie hasn't had any practice against these aggressive meta cards. And this doesn't even take into account how much practice and time that the competitive player has placed into testing their deck. Just think about how much practice and time that these competitive players place into achieving their desired consistency. And they've likely practiced enough to know how to get around the strategies that are designed to dismantle their own strategies. And this is why these elements precisely constitute why these new players get crushed in the tournament level. So yeah, these are the tips that I would offer to new players. And I think this advice could even be applied to all players, since some of these mistakes can even happen to the most experienced Yu-Gi-Oh! Players. But let me know which mistakes you see in new players and the most frequent ones they make. And hopefully this advice was helpful to any aspiring new Yu-Gi-Oh! Players out there. And with that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you would like to support more content like this, you can do so via donation on my Cash App. I need to resolve some issues with my Patreon, but I still post on there, and you can still catch my content on that same page. But for the meantime, you can help me out on Cash App by finding me at the Necromancer1040 Cash App tag. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next video. Alright, take care.